Super quick note. Over the past weekend or so, the channel reached 501 subscribers. It's not a huge in the scheme of things, not a huge deal, but for me, it's a pretty big deal. I'm a gamer at heart. Seeing the number go up and hit an even number, 500 is a very nice round number, and then to surpass that, super fun. I appreciate it. If you hang out and watch, um, if you watch quietly and never say a word, I appreciate it. If you come in to chat or comment in the comments, I also appreciate it. Thank you guys very much. So, all this talk about old school D&D and the right way to play, home brewing, just got me thinking a little bit. And I did text all my players and said, "So, what is your gaming nostalgia sweet spot?" Because I know I have a couple really big ones, places that I want to get back to, or never can get back to. It's never quite as good when you go back there. Um, where's your gaming nostalgia? Because I think some of this has to do with that. I think some of our love for the OSR and our love for the old days of D&D and first edition and AD, right? A lot of that there's a little bit of that harkens back to simply that carefree early days of gaming. Now the games have changed, and we can talk about that someday. Not right now. The landscape has changed, and again, maybe I'll that'll make this video too. That would be a very gripey video, but and we're not doing that today. But what we're doing is we're recognizing that we've changed, right? We're older. We all have kids, jobs, some mortgages. If you're lucky enough to have a house and a mortgage, lucky enough to have a mortgage. Who'd ever thought those words would have been spoken? But you know what I mean, right? We have adult concerns. Some of us have kids, and so on and so forth. So we have changed. So I think some of that love for those old days of those old games and those old days of those games, might come down to simply that lost youth kind of sort of mentality, that nostalgia that lures us in. So I did ask folks that I knew sort of, what is your gaming nostalgia? What makes you long for the halcyon days of those early games? And I thought about mine. And obviously, so back in 77-ish, yeah, my aunt bought my dad a copy of a box set of D&D, which contained Blue Book D&D, and some dice, which I still have here. Look at that guy. That is theoretically a 20-sided die. It is now mostly a sphere. The 12-sided die, the most maligned die in the history of the universe, which I love, by the way. Again, you can barely see these. Now, you never really got a 10-sided die because this was a 10-sided die. You just had to color in half the faces with a crayon or a pencil. And that would be add 10 to it. You can see some of the faces not, some of the faces are. So these dice, let's just say something. Lou Zocchi was right. This low impact plastic is crap. We need to make something better. And he did. He did. Dice so sharp. So I think I first played, and I vaguely remember it was either late 77 or 78. I don't remember, to be quite honest with you. I just remember my dad, my mom, my uncle. My dad ran a game with us. One weekend, maybe 2 nights. I only remember one night, really. I think one night was prepping, and then the next night was playing or whatnot. And by prepping, I just meant rolling your characters, buying your stuff. And we played, and I was hooked. Now, and my uncle did play. We'll get into that super briefly. My uncle played a little bit more. He had his own crew. He was several years older than I was, but way younger than my dad, right? So of course, as a kid, I idolized him because he was the cooler young uncle. But my mom and dad never played again, right? Not really. I latched on to D&D. Like it was great. I was hooked from the jump. Um, and so I immediately sort of gathered some folks up that I thought might want to play. We're all in elementary school. Remember, these are 8-year-old kids that we're talking about here. So a lot of it was walking, to Pete's house after school, and we could play with the books in the back and in the bag, so we could play. And we played a lot of basic D&D early, but then almost immediately wanted to upgrade to advanced D&D because we'd heard advanced D&D existed. And again, but you couldn't buy all the books at once. They didn't come out all at once. I think the Monster Manual came out first, the Player's Handbook came out second, and the DMG came out third. I bought the Player's Handbook first as soon as I could. There was no game stores in town. Bookstores did carry D&D. I'm not sure like it had gotten to that point yet, but so there was a game store between Newcastle and Boardman called the Breastplate, and it was this little shop just on the road, on the little highway. If you didn't know what it was, you'd have never pulled in there. And of course, every time we went to Boardman for any reason to go shopping, I wanted to stop there. And so I picked up the Player's Handbook. I probably begged my parents to pick it up for me, but I got, a little bit of cash here and there from birthdays and allowances and stuff like that. Picked up the Player's Handbook. So we were immediately just making it up as we go, because you had the Player's Handbook, but then the Blue Book D&D, not super compatible, only vaguely compatible, maybe. And so we started as soon as possible playing that. So I would say that, of course, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I do not have the Blue Book still. That one escaped me. These are by the way, do not shudder at the condition of these books. These books were very well used. They came with me everywhere. And these are original. This is 1978, this book. And that's how old this book is. And this book has been with me forever. Same thing with this one, the DMG. Now, this was slightly after 1979, I believe. But yeah, it came out several months after. So you didn't have this. You didn't have the 2-hit tables. You had the old 2-hit tables in the Blue Book that we used. And that's what we used. And the same thing for saving throws and so on. You didn't get that until later. So we had to sort of wing it. And we did very much. But so many campaigns. I mean, first off, these books are so evocative and right to absolutely strike your imagination. I still think the DMG is probably one of the greatest books for gaming ever written. Even if you've never played AD&D, it's just fun to have all those little quirks and little paragraphs that were written by Gary Gygax on things like dividing up treasure, or different types of insanity that your characters might face, or overworld adventures, or random dungeon creation. There's a whole system for creating a random dungeon in there, which we played, actually. I used to play with my cousins. We used to do that. But yeah, so we played a lot of games, and a lot of games, like I said, even in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 3rd through 6th grade, a lot of games were with that crew of very young kids. I remember a buddy of mine, Fred, and I we'd play, but we'd play a lot on the phone because we didn't because there just wasn't, getting together was not quite that easy in those grades. But we could play on the phone. And so he would run my paladin, I'd run his ranger through sort of solo-ish adventures. And it was all nutty stuff and overpowered and so on. And I'm sure my parents really appreciate me taking up the phone for 3 hours at a time. So, and Mr. and Mrs. Wright, I apologize for that. So we had that. So this is my apology toward everyone's parents, I think, is what this is going to turn into. Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy, thank you for letting us use your house. And Mr. and Mrs. Hauser, well, so we might as well do it. The apology tour, Mr. and Mrs. Hauser. And honorable mention, Mr. and Mrs. Abraham, whose house we did not burn down. Different story, different video. I will, but nonetheless, so AD&D, absolutely, that was my, um, that was absolutely my elementary school years. With one small divergence there was, and we actually had quite a few small divergences, right? Because everybody's buying games, different games, wanted to try them out. I forget the name of it, but man, Recon. I remember that one of the Hausers bought this Vietnam game, and they wanted to play, right, and so on. So there's all these different games, but primarily we stuck a lot with D&D. Another game that we did play a little bit, not quite as much, a little bit, was Traveler Book. This was my uncle fell into Traveler. Once they played those early things of D&D with his group of friends, they played a lot of Traveler, and they got into Traveler. We also, I got into Traveler sort of because, again, idolized him. They had the black books with all the supplements and stuff that came out, and we played with this Traveler book, which was essentially books 1 through 3. And just, again, a wonderful game. Mark Millar's Traveler was just, such an awesome sort of vibe. Very, very 70s science fiction, and in the 70s imperial science fiction, and it captures that so well. And I still love the vibe, and I'm still sad the computers no longer take up the size of a good-sized room. Because it's just one of the joys of this, is how amazing and yet clunky all the technology actually is, and how it feels real for that time period. So many things in here that I do love. But most of my elementary school days were D&D with that crew of Matt, Mark, Mitch, Pete, Fred, that crew, again, of young kids who didn't know jack all about what we were doing. But we had a lot of very fun weekend sleepovers, and played a lot of D&D, and we were killer GMs, we were Monty Hall DMs, we were everything in between. And that was a joy. In junior high, I sort of fell out with a lot of those kids because we moved, not far, just across town, but we moved, and fell in with another group, and they wanted to play D&D, and they had not played D&D. And I had played quite a bit of D&D by this time. I was as much of an expert, I think, in my town as you were going to have. A 7th grade kid. And and so this was a buddy of mine who was also in my grade, and then a bunch of his older friends, right? So that's Dave, John, Sue, and Lynn primarily. And we played essentially AD&D with a couple modules that I had. Actually, we played a basic module, but with advanced D&D, it worked just well enough. We played the Lost City, I think, was our first module. And great, and then that was it. And we played like throughout sort of my junior high and the first half of my high school years. We played, play with that crew almost exclusively, and it was great. Some of the best, literally, that was a great time growing up, right? Playing a lot of D&D, right? So Friday nights and or Saturday nights, they'd come over. We all lived within vague walking distance of each other, so someone would knock on the door, bam, I would get my GM's crap into a briefcase, which my grandfather gave me, and we would walk through the cold, snowy streets of my town to one of the houses, and then, sit down and play. So again, Mr. and Mrs. Senko, Bellion, and Scheffler, I apologize for having really loud young teenagers laughing and sort of yelling at each other over dice, in their kitchens and basements. and it was a great time. And for a young sort of nerdy, quiet junior high kid to have a group of friends that was all in high school, because that's aside from Dave, everybody else was a couple years older. Um, that was a godsend too. That was a great that helped out so much to have sort of a built-in tribe, as it were. I think that's the one thing that always, when I look at kids that struggle through junior high and high school, what you realize is a lot of them don't end up with their tribe, right? They don't find their folks. Maybe they don't find them until ever. Maybe they don't find them until college. Maybe they never find them. But having those guys throughout those years was just so important to me. I cannot express that. So very, very fun there. And that campaign was one of the best. Like, that is a campaign that's still, like, I still have the map, I think, somewhere. Big world, right? It was that whole big world. And you had a lot of still Lord of the Rings media, and you had Sword of Shannara, and so you had a lot of Dark Lord coming through the continent. And there was, I remember, the Great Wall and the city of Tyrsis. And, we had plots over plots over plots, all pertaining to this, the looming threat of the Dark Lord. And I remember the one sort of so lots of that. I remember the one sort of sub game where they were infiltrating the city of Tyrsis that had been taken over by dark forces, and they were going through a tunnel. So there was a tunnel system miles deep, which would sneak them into the city so that they could, I forget why, steal something, rescue someone. Just great games. I remember them fondly. If you asked me whether I would play, because we tried to play Traveller or AD&D, if you said run a first edition AD&D campaign, I think I would do it. Traveller, I don't think I would do it. I think that's a game that actually aged weirdly more poorly, even though being a more modern design. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me why. But there's just something about those old games which hits a nostalgia vibe, and a lot of it had to do with the people there, right? I mean, it was a whole vibe. The games were great. We were all good friends. One of the players was my first crush as a kid, kind of thing, right? A whole vibe. It's embarrassing, but it's a whole vibe. Again, hard to beat nostalgia, kids. It's very hard. And of course, at some point in time, people move on. They want to do different things. Different stuff's going on. And we actually met up with a different group. So it was me and John, and to a lesser extent, Dave, met up with a different group of dudes, Rich and another Dave and Scott. And we played a lot. So that campaign that we talked about with Dave and John and Sue and Lynn lasted over 5 years. It was like 5 or 6 years. And different people flitted in and out. So we had different roster of players. And so we met this second gaming group. And it was, like I said, Rich and a second Dave and John. And Joe, but he flitted in and out. There was, again, people flitted in and out. So that game sort of lasted throughout. And again, in that one, it was the same campaign. And I remember, I think it was John playing like a halfling prince and his brother. And there was a whole thing about this halfling kingdom. We had a whole war, which was actually pretty incredible. With that crew, just to decide this fate of this one small kingdom, amongst this over, I wish, if the Dark Lord would have just hurried up, he'd have probably taken over the world, but never quite managed. It was always a looming threat, but never quite got there. In the meantime, the halflings were liberated by this crew. And so again, apology tour, Mr. and Mrs. Hunt, Mr. and Mrs. Childs, and Mr. and Mrs. Falion again. Again, I appreciate what they sort of put up with, because there was a lot of late nights, right? By then, we were all in high school, so a lot of driving, late nights, a lot of, hey, we're going to come Friday night and stay through Saturday and play 48 hours of D&D, like that kind of crap. And again, as a parent now, I look back and go, man, we were obnoxious little twits. Like they put up with a lot of stuff from us. So again, I do appreciate their patience with us through what really are my formative years, really, to come to think of it. So the one thing I think there that was sort of fascinating was that's when we also started switching. Like a D&D was a huge amount of our playtime, but I'd bought a lot of different games and books and we played. The next thing that we played, and which really caught us, was Champions, was Hero System. Where AD&D, you had fairly limited characters and you rolled stats, and the systems were somewhat disjointed. Like D&D is a great game, but it's not a amazingly put together game. It is a lot of parts that just happen to come together into a beautiful whole, but it is not a well-oiled machine. How's that? It is more a series of slapped on systems that then work together to produce a good experience. A lot of people talk about no, I don't play any of those, but a lot of people talk about Heroes Unlimited and Rifts and so on as a little bit like that. The people that love Rifts, no one's arguing that it's a great game, but they're arguing that its experience transcends any specific rule, and I agree with that. I think D&D is that for sure. But Hero System, totally different beast. By the way, Hero System, it's really not that many mechanics. The mechanics in Hero System are fairly tight. The character creation is all point-based, so it's all balanced. Now, put that in air quotes because, point systems can be imbalanced as well. And you could make any superhero you wanted for the most part. And the original Champions books, which I no longer own, I don't know where they got tossed or thrown or whether they just fell apart or whatnot, were sort of soft cover, magazines almost, but a little sturdier magazines, but they were soft cover books. It was Champions 1, Champions 2, Champions 3, or Champions 2, and Champions 3. Each one added onto Champions. And we created a bunch of superheroes. So I remember, Sky Knight and Red Rider and Lemim. That was Joe. He played the mime, which I thought, which was great, but it was a French word, so it was sophisticated to us. Right. And Dave was always playing like a ninja of some sort, like some super ninja. And the mechanics of Hero were just so well put together to us and so different. Man, that game took off, and we played a ton of Champions as well. So that's sort of where, and then we had a couple years of just superhero games with different heroes sort of roaming in and out. And I won't say that there were super memorable campaigns. There was a few memorable moments, but I don't know that those campaigns were memorable. But just I think the hold that Hero took on us and Champions took on us was actually pretty impressive because it was just such a good idea, frankly. That's sort of what I remember. Now, I don't have any of those books. I do have the 5th edition Hero book, which you can look at this thing. This thing is also a home defense system, paperweight, and, weightlifting, fitness system. It's also, I think, a floor wax and a dessert topping. So there's a lot to this book. Earlier versions were not quite as big and chunky. But we played a lot of that, and then And then as we got older, and then a lot of those folks actually filtered off to college because they were all older than me. I got into a lot of the third edition Hero printed material. So they also made a bunch of games which you could just buy. So Justice Incorporated, Fantasy Hero, Space Hero, or Star Hero, actually is what it was called. There was even Cyber Hero, Danger International. They produced all these very nice, well put together, self-contained books. Like you could buy any one of them and just play without the main Champions books. But we played a great deal of Hero system and Hero got me through. So that was all for a while. At some point, we ditched the D&D game and we only played Hero at that point. We played Fantasy Hero if we wanted Fantasy, Space Hero for Champions, mostly Fantasy Hero and Champions. And that took me in through college. Now, college is where I met Scott, the Scott that you all know that you might have seen. First year of college, looking for someone to play games with, right? New school, don't know anybody. Just me and my roommate, which I don't know. And, that led to that Fantasy Hero game, which was the first Bostonia game, was Fantasy Hero, which we played in my dorm room on the floor because there was no space for tables. The dorm rooms were not just about as big as this office, really. And that was Todd and Scott and Sue, a different Sue. And we played that game. And that game flitted in and out with a bunch of people. And that's probably one of the most memorable games from that era was that first Bostonia game. And it was 3 kids whose village had been burned, right, by Talak raiders, and they fled into the wilderness and ultimately made their way. And it was all Hero system. And Bostonia was just sort of a vague idea of, hey, let's make a fantasy world that was post-apocalypse, but not Gamma, right? It wasn't super science. It was Thundar the Barbarian, but less science and more magic really took over, right? And that's where the idea sort of came from, and that's sort of where we started. There was no map, really. It was not a well fleshed out idea. It was simply actually a way for me with a college schedule to be able to quickly make games up and be able to play at a drop of a hat, because I could just go, oh, you know what we're going to do? They're going to go raid a convenience store. But really the convenience store just has, the clerks can then become monsters with maybe a manager boss, and they can take things out of the chest of ice and throw these icicles at them, as opposed to like a cooler with, ice cream confectionery. Like, right, I could just vaguely imagine a place and go, okay, let me make this place manager now. And that was sort of the original idea. It was like, how can I just prep on a dime? And the idea of prepping on a dime was take a real place and just go, yep, it's magic. And I can figure that out. And it takes me 10 minutes to jot down some ideas. Hero's actually very good at that, because you can just go and go, well, I don't have to think about what this does. I can go, well, it's a 1d6 plus 1 killing attack. Done. Bam. And that's it. And Hero, then it's part of Hero. It just works. Hero's really good at that. If you ever need a generic, universal sort of system and don't mind numbers, Hero is the way to go. GURPS is a good game, but I still argue that Hero is just slightly better put together, in my opinion. So again, we played quite a bit of Hero, and I'll get to the last sort of bits of this, of course, soon, which is, so we played through college. At the very end, when I was, when we were graduating and I was going to go to grad school and so on, we did meet up with another crew of folks. And, that sort of set up for and that was Scott, his to-be wife, Karen, who wasn't at the time, a couple guys from a frat that we knew and had hung out with, Tom, a good friend Tom, who I'm out of touch with at this point, and we played the space game, right? It was Space Hero, just a sprawling game. Another one that lasted 2 or 3 years, and we would play, and man, we'd play at the house that we all were in, and that was a lot of it. But then there were some nights we would go onto campus, and I remember we were having a gigantic space battle. It was like the culmination of, a whole sub campaign, right? And there was this going to be giant space battle with like 20 or 30 ships on a side. And we thought, man, we need like a chalkboard or a whiteboard to track all this stuff. And so we actually went, and at the time, schools weren't so security conscious, so you could just go into some of these buildings and walk in and go to a classroom. And so we hijacked a classroom like 8-9 o'clock in the evening and just played out this gigantic space battle on the mat, but also on the board. And it was just, again, good memories from that game. And that's also at the end, sort of the ending of that crew, and then into sort of adulthood is where Runebearer came about. I think it was the late 90s, I'm pretty sure. And I had actually, so I think it wasn't that crew. I had moved away. I'd actually moved back to Pittsburgh after being away for 2 years, came back, played Fantasy Hero with a bunch of dudes that I had met along with some of these folks. And then ultimately that turned into Runebearer, a little bit of a dissatisfaction with Hero after having played it with a dozen years. And I thought maybe I should write a fantasy game. and that's sort of where we ended up. I could go on. This one's probably long enough. But I would say that my sweet spot for nostalgia, but I've way past my sweet spot for nostalgia, I suppose is my point. So I only meant this to be about a half hour, so I'm going to start cutting it short. Since there is no point to this, it literally is just a walk through nostalgic times in my head, right? I would say that my sweet spot for nostalgia was that high school, that junior high to high school period, playing all those games of AD&D and segueing into hero system games in later high school. I mean, I'm not going to say that was the peak of gaming, because I actually don't think it was. Strangely enough, I think, my gaming peak, don't get me wrong, I'm not nostalgic for current day, but I actually think current day we've run some of the best games consistently that I have run and played in have been the past 3 games we've run. So I think we're peaking now, I hope, or at least not peaking, but climbing. But as far as peak nostalgia, it's Hero System and Advanced D&D. It is Dave and other Dave S. and Dave C. John, of course, who I still play with today, Sue, Lynn, Scott, and Rich. I think those are my peak sort of nostalgia vibes. So I suppose what I would ask, if anyone watches this at all, which I don't expect it to, because I'm literally just musing about things you're like, yeah, what? I don't even know what you're talking about. But what is your nostalgic vibe? What is your best game? What games would you go back to in a heartbeat? What campaigns? What people? What groups do you miss? What is your gaming nostalgia? And I'd be interested to hear from different folks and different ages too, because, again, I'm 54 almost. And, 1978, I was 8 years old. So I have a different I come from a different headspace with these games because I literally grew up with these games. And I mean that in that as they grew up, I also grew up. So I'm sort of interested to hear if you're younger, you may have a totally different vibe, a totally different, nostalgic vibe. And if you are as old as I am, but maybe you have a different experience, maybe a different entry point into games, where are you at? So that's all. This is a ramble. I totally appreciate it if you actually watched for any length of time. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.